So let's talk about all the the vast agencies and departments and all these tens of thousands of people, who work within them. A lot of people who voted for Trump. I mean, there was really a majority in this country that wanted to see a house cleaning, and they wanted to see it the first time. Frankly, I mean, they wanted the guy who says you're fired, to come in there. So if you were advising the Trump administration now on this, what needs to be done in terms of just the bureaucracy that already is technically under the president, but it's extremely difficult to get rid of people? I mean, we hear these horror stories all the time, right? I mean, mutual friend likes to tell a story about some guy who was looking at porn on his computers all day, right? It was almost impossible to fire him. I mean, there's many such cases, and you have very important roles where, these people do not agree with the mandate that President Trump has. So what would your advice be to them now in the second administration to take care of that problem?
So the first step, which President Trump has taken, I think is going to be fully successful, is making the first line, right? The cabinet secretaries, the heads of these agencies, subject to direct presidential command. Then the next level below that, I think, also has to be placed under presidential command too. And this is where the next fight will be. And I don't know how the Supreme Court's eventually going to come out on this, because the court has said that Congress can create a kind of civil service that has protections who are employees. So, for example, secretaries, the people who are involved in keeping the agency running day to day, but they don't make policy decisions. The Supreme Court has upheld giving them a kind of protection from being fired. I'm not sure actually constitutionally that was the original understanding, but that has something that's been around now for about 150 years. In between the cabinet secretaries and these employees is this middle area, the one that you are identifying, Matt, I think, which is people who make policy. So far, they've been protected by civil service rules. But I think those people also should be subject to presidential control. I think anybody who is making policy in the federal government within the executive branch has to be subject to presidential control. That's the next battleground, I think, for the Trump White House, is to claim the power to control that class of officials too. They're the ones who are really making policy on a day-to-day basis. And I think they're not just employees. I think they wield substantial authority. And if they do, then I think the president should be able to control them, because they too are really assisting him in carrying out his constitutional responsibilities. And if we don't have presidential control of those officials, then how do we as the American people, as the voters, ever hold them accountable?
Yeah. So one of the fascinating things to me about all of this is that, it's Donald Trump at the end of the day, right, who has actually been pressing these issues in sort of the tip of the spear that people have been arguing about and wrangling about for a very, very long time. And I know, you wrote a book almost to me directed at all those people who sort of thought, oh, Trump's crazy. He's all over the place. And this media narrative about him being this wild and crazy character who really was a threat to our sacred democracy and all this sort of thing. You wrote a book explaining his presidency last time around. And so now you see more in general the way he's approaching the executive branch now. There's all these issues that have been popping up every day, from federalizing D.C., the DOJ, the Epstein files, the Russiagate stuff, right, coming out. And all of it revolves around, a very different president than we've seen in quite some time. So how do you kind of analyze in a bigger picture with some of these examples the way in which he's approached the office this term?
So thanks for mentioning that book. This is the book I wrote about his first term, Defender in Chief, I called it, because my argument there was, despite all these attacks, if you look at what Trump actually did, rather than what he says, but what he did, he was acting within, I think, what other presidents had done. Now, some of our greatest presidents have pushed the envelope of executive power, like Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, even presidents I don't agree with, like FDR, but they pushed the envelope of presidential power. And I don't think Trump was doing anything that was really outside the boundaries of what his predecessors had done. I think this term he is going beyond those boundaries, but he is really fulfilling the ideas of constitutional scholars who have really thought hard about the presidency. He's just the one who had the political cojones to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not a question of constitutional authority, I think. I think President Reagan could have done all these things, but even President Reagan felt politically constrained from attempting to really reform the executive branch, really to press presidential powers as far as people like a Hamilton or a Lincoln or a Jackson thought he could. So I think what President Trump is doing is he's reacting to the demand of the American people for serious reform in our political institutions. And as a result, he is turning to this wellspring of executive power which the Constitution makes available. From time to time, presidents have used it. And I think the ultimate, and I argued this in my first book too, ultimately the test of whether he should do this, and some of this is going to be historical. We're going to look back on his second term and say, was it the right thing to do? Would be, it's more of a decision of statesmanship. Do the times demand that the president turn to this reservoir of power and make it available? And that's something that only statesmen really can make the right judgment. And we, as you and I sitting as observers, can criticize, comment, praise, but it's really the person in the Oval Office who has to make that decision. Do the times fit the exercise of power?
Yeah, and your point is that the power is there. I mean, the executive power is there, and so much of what's being called tyranny and fascism, et cetera, is just simply, now a lot of it's just partisan nonsense, but a lot of it's what should we say, an ignorance about the power that exists constitutionally for the executive, and the fact that if you don't think it's politically prudent to do it, then you won't use it. But what I'm astounded by is, and I'm relishing, I enjoy watching, is just seeing the political will, right? The will is there to actually do things, to actually get things done. So let's talk about a few of those things. One of them, near and dear to my heart, is very concerning to me, is what we've seen in the last decade when it came to Russiagate or Russia collusion, these accusations against the president. This was my moment. I remember flying back from Washington, D.C., it was 2017 or 2018, and realizing how bad this was, like how, this corruption was within the DOJ, was within FBI. This stuff was nonsense. They'd been basically spying on the president, colluding with the media and spreading this stuff. And I remember being in the Department of Justice. I was like 12 years old, meeting Ed Meese, shaking his hand, and my dad saying, he's in charge of this whole building, right? And I thought, wow. I mean, at the soul of America is this notion of the rule of law, and that is broken down in some of the national security complex and in FBI and DOJ. So when you see that, now these documents are coming forth about what happened. What is your take on what's going on now and what should be done in the future? Because I think my worry and the worry of a lot of people in the audience is, there should be real structural reforms here. How do we make sure this sort of thing doesn't happen again? And how do we make sure we punish wrongdoers and make sure this isn't possible again? What's your take on all that?
First, we should remember that the president is the one under the Constitution who's given the duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. That means the president is, under the Constitution, the chief law enforcement officer in the United States. And so there you will see people who think that there should be some distance or separation between the president and the Justice Department, or that somehow it's wrong for the president to dictate who should be prosecuted and who shouldn't be, and where resources should be devoted for law enforcement. That's completely erroneous. It's the president who's in charge of law enforcement. And so if he wants to devote more energies, for example, on immigration removal, rather than, for example, environmental protection, that's up to the president. And we, by electing the president, we are the American people setting those priorities. So that's something important to remember. With this question, if there have been abuses in the past by the Justice Department and FBI, and I think the record shows that if there were misuse of the vast powers we gave the government to actually chase foreign spies or to combat terrorism, and instead there were people within our own law enforcement agencies who abuse that power to instead attack political enemies and rivals or people they didn't like, then they should be investigated, tried, and ultimately punished. And if President Trump wants to do that, he can. I've seen reports by the Inspector General at the Justice Department who has said that he thinks that some of these things happened. And he recommended people for prosecution, like the former director of the FBI, Jim Comey. And I've seen the head of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, who himself is a former federal prosecutor, refer for prosecution by the Justice Department, former heads of the intelligence agencies under the Obama administration. So these are not frivolous claims, and I think they should be investigated by the Justice Department today. In fact, I would say, having worked in the department in the years after 9/11, one thing that I never thought would happen, again, because this was the mistake I think that was made during Watergate, one thing I thought would never happen again is that we would see our intelligence agencies, our counterintelligence, counterterrorism agencies, use their powers, which are designed to protect the country from foreign threats, and instead turn it inwards for partisan political purposes. And if that has happened, then that has to be rooted out and punished, because we can't let that happen. The reason we give the government those powers is so that it can protect us from foreign attacks and foreign threats, not for domestic political purposes.
I really want to get to the judiciary at the end here, but I want to stick with this for a moment because it's so important right now and it's so concerning. Do you have thoughts about what the administration should do to reform the national security complex and some of those agencies to make sure that they return to actually protecting America and not being involved in domestic affairs or censoring people or all the things we've seen some evidence of over the last 10 years. Do you have any thoughts about what the administration should do?
I mean, this is a hard problem. I've always thought that we should shrink the size of the FBI. I've also thought that we should reduce the federal government's role in criminal policing domestically. That's a job that the Constitution gives primarily to the states. And I've always thought that we have over criminalized at the federal level. And maybe one solution is to point the CIA and the FBI and the NSA abroad and say, look, your original mission is to protect us from foreign threats, from foreign attacks. You should not be in the business of intervening domestically. And so, yes, the FBI plays an important role in domestic law enforcement, but maybe we should have less federal government involvement in criminal law at home and reorient our resources and attention to fighting and watching our rivals like China or Russia or Iran, and let the states take care of criminal law at home, except in truly national areas. And maybe that would be the start of a solution.
Sounds good to me. What about the judiciary? We have the initial flurry, right? Phase one of the Trump administration was all these executive orders, a lot of movement, clearly pre-planned. I mean, it was unbelievable to watch. And now you see parts of the administration locked into sort of more serious battles now that they've established themselves. But throughout this, everyone's had to watch all these court cases and this judicial activism throughout the nation. I mean, Trump has had unprecedented attacks or obstacles thrown up by the courts in these 6+ months. So what's your take on that? What should they do? Is this going to end? Is this going to continue? How do you view this?
I think one thing the American people are seeing, maybe for really clearly for the first time, is how decentralized and disorganized our federal courts are. We have about 800 active federal district judges, and I think they're what we call senior judges who are semi-retired. That brings that number up to 1,000. And any one of those judges had thought until this last summer that they could enjoin the entire federal government, the entire presidency, from pursuing a policy without check from any other individual judge at their level. You would have to go on these lengthy, expensive appeals to a court of appeals or even to the Supreme Court to overturn a single judge who, for example, disagreed with the president's order on firing or downsizing the executive branch. And so one thing is, yes, these trial judges, some of them have been waging a war against President Trump's agenda. And one thing we've seen so far is that the Supreme Court has to get the judiciary's house in order, and it's been trying. Every time these cases have gotten to the Supreme Court, the Trump administration has basically won, because what the Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court, saying, you justices, get your own house in order. You can't allow one of 1,000 judges randomly picked or even actually deliberately picked to enjoin the policies of the entire federal government nationwide. And so every time the court has been presented with that, it has actually tried to narrow what trial judges can do. It's actually stripped away some of these cases from these trial judges. And it's been saying, we're going to start accelerating these cases to get to the Supreme Court as quickly as possible. Whereas I said, in our earlier discussion, I think the Trump administration is doing much better than people think, certainly much better than the critics of the Trump administration would have you believe, because I think the president in many of these areas has been trying to reassert the constitutional authority of the president over what the executive branch does.
Well, since we have a law professor with us today, I have to ask, are there any other cases or issues that you are keenly following or interested in when it comes to these matters, as we move forward, that may be off the radar for a lot of people?
Mm-hmm. Well, putting aside this question of the size of the presidency, I think the other major issue where our nation has been making great progress now with the return of President Trump, and where the Supreme Court has been very active, has been extinguishing the government's use of race in making decisions. We saw that in the Harvard case a few years ago, where the Supreme Court said state universities and private colleges that receive federal funds cannot use race when it picks who to admit, or when it picks who to hire, or who to fire. These are the rules that basically apply to the rest of American society, but the Supreme Court, I think, mistakenly had granted an exception to colleges and universities. Now, I think colleges and universities are still cheating and are still using race in all these decisions. And so what we've seen is the Trump administration is redoubling investigations and efforts to try to get universities to stop. And you can see how hard universities still deeply believe that they have the right to be racial engineers, because they're still fighting back. So I think you're going to see more cases like that come to the Supreme Court. There's a big one that is already headed for the court has already agreed to hear it. So it's already on the docket, which would say that states can no longer consider race when they draw congressional districts. This is also a remaining area where Congress and the Supreme Court in the past, to overcome, I think, the shameful legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, allowed the use of race to try to repair, to remedy all that bad history. And one of the ways they said to do it was you could take race into account when you draw congressional districts. But I think it's now about 60 years later, and it's time for our society to stop using race there too. There's a Supreme Court case now that will ask the justices, should congressional districts that were drawn deliberately with the consciousness of race, for example, to try to put as many minorities as possible in a congressional district so that they will vote for somebody of their race, which I think is actually a pernicious assumption about the way minorities think. I'm not going to vote for an Asian to be my member of Congress just because he or she's Asian. I care about their policies and what they would vote for. I think that's a case that's going to be on the court's docket this year. And I think if the court does the right thing, and say no more use of race in drawing congressional districts, that will be another step towards progressing towards really getting us to a colorblind society.
Well said. It is astonishing how the Civil Rights Act is being used by the Trump administration to say, hey, this was the deal. This was what we thought we were about as Americans. And yet we have these recalcitrant institutions who don't want to do this. So what do you think? I'm curious about the universities. Do you think that they, now they're feeling the pressure that they will actually change? It strikes me that might take a while because, like you say, they'll just try to hide it for a while.
I have to say, I think the Trump administration has been making remarkable progress on this front. I think that universities have really, and I've been saying this for many years, ever since I was a professor, really, that universities have gone seriously off track in their use of race in all kinds of decisions. And when they've been caught, they just hide it. That's where we got this DEI industry from. They just changed the name to diversity, equity, inclusion from pure racial quotas, which the American people, huge majorities of American people, including minority groups, hate and don't want done. And so I think I always thought it would be a long time. It would take a lot of work and time to uproot this pernicious ideology from the way our universities operate. So I think, even though, I agree with everything the Trump administration has proposed to do to universities, I agree with a lot of it. And because I think that there has to be this kind of big bang to try to wake up people within our universities to prevent them from using race anymore. And I think they've been making a fair amount of progress. They made a lot of progress with a settlement with Columbia University. We'll see if they settle with Harvard too. But the proof is going to be in the pudding in this respect. These universities, they might agree and say, yes, we'll pay $200 million fine, $500 million fine, and we promise not to use race ever again. But their record has not been good, because when they've agreed, or not agreed, when they've been forced by the courts, stop using race, I think they just cheat. They cheat. And I think everyone knows they're cheating. And so part of what the Trump administration has to do is not just win these settlements, but to stay on top of the universities to make sure that they keep their word. Because otherwise, I think they're just going to go back to their bad old ways again.
Well, John, thanks so much for your time today. Your blessing to California. And when you want to come back to America, America welcomes you with open arms.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be with you. But as you can see, in California, it's also sunny and warm all the time too, year round. So that's hard to leave California too, which means that's why the government can tax us and overregulate us, because they know the weather still keeps us here.
True. Thank you.